Welcome back to the Life on Books podcast. My name is Tony. With me, as always, is Andy, a.k.a. Metafictional Meathead. And today we are talking about Shogun, the book/television show, and the proliferation of...
Good word.
Yeah, of books being turned into movies and TV, which has always been a thing, but seems to be more common than ever. And the more... I just keep discovering more and more and more shows and movies that are based on books.
Yeah.
So we'll get into that. But let's start with what we used to do, which is, what are you currently reading?
I've been reading a few different things. Well, a couple different things. You know, still in a bit of a slump trying to get back into it.
Yep.
But I ended up pulling the plug on Praiseworthy by Alexis Wright. Just, again, whether it was because of all the stuff going on we talked about last time, or just the book, or a little column A, a little column B, I kind of just wasn't really into it, or couldn't get into it, wasn't really connecting. You know, I think I said on the last episode we did, you know, were pretty short chapters, you know, like 3 to 5 pages at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And at least in the past, like, with something like that, it's very, at least for me, like, okay, you get that one chapter and it was quick, like on to the next, on to the next, on to the next, on to the next. And the next thing you know, you've read, you know, 30 to 40 pages. And again, whether it was the book or my personal stuff or a mix of both, like I'd get one or two and be like, okay, you know, this is good. And I just wasn't kind of focusing on it and all that. So I was enjoying it enough that I'll definitely go back and give it another whirl, or maybe try one of her other books. I've certainly heard a lot of praise for her work. So
Yeah.
But I took my own advice and went back to a little bit of Clarice Lispector.
Cool.
Read some more of Too Much of Life. And you know, what's like I said, what's nice about that book is it's, you know, very fragmented. You don't have to, like, you can just pick it up. It doesn't matter if it's been a day, 2 days, 2 months, whatever, like, because they're just, you know, really short. They're like newspaper entries.
Oh, cool.
So, and it's, I think it's like 6 or 7 years worth of, you know, entries that she did. And it's clearly marked, like each year is a new section. So I got to the end of whatever year I was on and put it down for a little bit. I've been reading Lost Empress by Sergio de la Pava.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
I believe it was the third book he published. He had one.
And he wrote A Bended Circuity.
Naked Singularity.
Naked Singularity, right?
Yes.
Very similar kind of, like,
yes.
intonation on those names.
Yeah, and the covers, at least with the Corona Samizdat edition of
Yes.
ABC, are pretty similar.
They're both black and white, right?
Yeah, and they both have kind of, well, Circuity has the concentric circles kind of spiraling out, and then Circuity just kind of has like radio wave zebra stripe pattern. But anyway, you know, it was recently announced that De La Pava's got a new book coming out this fall. I had pre-ordered my copy, and I was like, hey, I really liked Naked Singularity. Maybe his work will kind of get back into me. I'm not into it as much as I was with A Naked Singularity. The writing is good. It seems to me, you know, A Naked Singularity definitely had like multiple narrative threads.
Mm-hmm.
At least so far. Lost Empress does as well, and it seems to maybe have more, or they're a little bit more scattered. So it's about 500 something pages. I'm a little over 200 in. So it's still early on enough where they won't really start to converge yet, but they still feel a little bit more scattered than, and you know, it has short chapters as well. And it seems like it kind of jumps from one to the other without really developing as much of the, that particular narrative thread before changing over to the next one. But I'm into it enough that, gonna keep reading. And yesterday, with it being kind of a crappy weather day here, I popped myself in the library, did a little bit more reading of that. And
like you went to the actual library?
no, my own library. No, I didn't leave the house.
I was like, wow, that's cool.
I left the house to get Chinese food yesterday, and that was it.
Nice.
I did a little bit of reading of the Passion According to G.H., which is another Lispector novel. I only read about 20, 30 pages of that, so not much of an opinion yet, but
cool.
She's great, so I'm sure it'll be enjoyable.
Yeah.
Or interesting, to say the least.
I mean, it's good to hear you back into reading. That's good.
Yeah.
I'm kind of in a similar situation where I'm not fully out of my slump, which is more probably mechanical than psychological. Just having a really hard time staying awake.
Yeah.
Anytime I do any type of relaxing activity. So just for an update for people, because I did receive probably half a dozen messages after we posted the last one. People were, sending me well wishes, which is appreciated and just kind of crazy. I don't know if I had actually received the apnea results of when we recorded the last podcast, but I got my sleep apnea results in, and as I told you, Andy, the threshold for severe sleep apnea is where you have 30 events per hour, and what they consider an event is when you stop breathing for a minimum of 10 seconds. And so if you have 30 cessations in breathing per hour, that's severe. I had 96, so I was more than triple the threshold.
Yeah.
And my blood oxygen saturation was dipping into the 60% range. So for those that aren't up to speed on kind of the medical lingo, your blood oxygen saturation should be somewhere between like 95 and 100% at all times. And if you were to throw up a pulse oximeter on your finger, and even like the cheap ones you can get at the pharmacy over the counter, or like the Oura Ring, or a lot of these Fitbit metrics, they're actually fairly accurate in measuring that because of just the way the technology works. If you see that number like below 90%, you should probably go to the hospital.
Yeah.
So the fact that it's dipping into the 60% range is extremely dangerous. People can and do die from sleep apnea. I don't think it's that bad every night, because there's certainly some nights where I do sleep mostly through the night and feel somewhat better in the morning.
Yeah.
But either case, once the results were reviewed, they basically were like, oh, this is urgent. We need to have this treated immediately. So I went to have a sleep study done in a laboratory where they titrate you for the CPAP mask, which basically you wear a mask and it blows pressure into your mouth to keep your airways open. So it's not oxygen. It's literally just air pressure, because what happens when you have apnea is the muscles in your throat and mouth relax, and then the airway closes down.
Right.
And so I had that put on. I passed out, and I didn't wake up until the technician woke me up in the morning. And I honestly cannot remember the last time I slept all the way through the night.
Yeah, I remember you telling me that, because obviously listeners won't know, but I stayed and watched the dogs for you while you were doing that. And I remember when you got home in the morning, you were just like, yeah, that was the best I have slept in forever.
Yeah, so it's insane. Usually when you have some type of ailment or condition or something going on, the change is very gradual, and it progressively gets worse over time. And so you don't really necessarily notice how bad things have become.
Right.
And an example that is used a lot of times is like when you need new tires in your car and you have them put on and you're like, wow, now my car handles like so much better. You didn't realize how crappy your tires had become because the wear was gradual. So it was kind of like that. And I've heard people talk about having like acupuncture or like chiropractic adjustments, or, different things happen. And they're like, all of a sudden, like colors seem more vibrant, and, foods taste better, and like life just seems like sweeter. Like that's literally how I felt the day after. And I was like, wow, I did not realize how crappy I felt. The unfortunate thing is they don't send you home with a machine. So what happens now is someone has to review the test results again, and then they send it to your doctor's office, and then they place an order, and then a home care company comes and sets it up in your home. And so I'm waiting for that to happen, and it's very frustrating because I'm like, wow, I felt so good, and now I have like a few more weeks of feeling crappy. So with all that said, I've been reading Dispatches by Michael Eyre, and he was a war correspondent during Vietnam. Mm-hmm. It's considered one of the best books about Vietnam, one of the best war-related books of all time. It's very different. So a lot of war-related books are either historical records or they're memoirs.
Right.
This kind of isn't either. It's certainly... I mean, I guess you would call it a memoir. However, it's not a linear story. It kind of reads like detached literature, like this kind of, I guess you could call it stream of conscious. So there's no like, here's what happened at the beginning, and then this happened, and then, there's no narrative really. He's literally just like recounting different scenarios or taking the essence of how he felt during his time there and just writing very poetically about it. I actually think a lot of fiction readers that aren't into nonfiction would probably enjoy it. He's a fantastic writer. Obviously, we know Vietnam was a really brutal war.
Yeah.
There was a lot of bombing kind of indiscriminately. Basically, like, we can't find the enemy, so we're just going to flatten this whole country. There was a lot of racism at play, probably on both sides. We don't like Asian people. We don't like white people.
Right.
There was... the addition of a lot of newer technologies. Like, that was really the first war where like jets were employed rather than planes. So it's really good. I'm enjoying it. And then I'm still plugging my way through Musashi. Mm-hmm. I have that on my Kindle because my physical copy, the text is just too small and I will literally like fall asleep in 2 seconds. Right. Honestly, not loving that. A lot of people compare it to Shogun. Like, a lot of people like, if you like Shogun, you'll like Musashi. I just find the writing, and this absolutely could be a translation thing, but I just find the writing too basic. It's just too, like, there's a lot of tell and not show.
When was that written? I mean, I know it's kind of a classic, but...
I believe it was written in the 50s.
Oh.
Yeah.
I don't know. For some reason, I thought it was older than that.
No, it's about a real samurai that lived in the feudal era. But, E.G. Oh, God, I'm blanking on his name. And I can't look it up because we don't have internet right now because of the storm. So, yeah, it's not that old. I mean, it's a classic, but it's not that old. And I just... I think I was telling you this at one point, but it's like there's this character and he gets sent to prison, and then literally in the next paragraph, it's 3 years later when he's getting out. And it's just like, there wasn't even a chapter break. And I was just like, what? So it kind of skips over a lot of the intimate details that I think add realism to a story. And that's always a spectrum, right? Like, people criticize an author like Charles Dickens for being too descriptive, and there's just too much detail about things that don't matter. I think this is the opposite end of the spectrum, where it's just like huge gaps in time and in like characters' reactions, and so it makes the characters feel a little two-dimensional because you never really get a good sense for their personalities. But I'm going to plug my way through it. It's like, it's a 1,000-page book. I'll get to it when I get to it.
Yeah.
And then I'm also reading Invisible Man,
Nice.
which is great. But that's another tough one when I'm sleepy because the chapters are kind of long.
Yeah.
Even though the book is maybe only 450 or maybe 500 pages. So
Yeah.
anyway, that is our reading update. Whatever you guys are reading at the time of watching this, share below in the comments. So let's get into today's topic, which is Shogun, the television show, and then we'll talk a little bit about maybe TV/movies versus books in general. So, are you caught up on Shogun?
Yes.
So they are what, 5 episodes in?
Yes.
Do we know how long the season is going to be? Is it going to be 8
Not
or
off the
10?
top of my head. I would assume 10.
So for those who aren't familiar, Shogun is a novel by the author James Clavell. It's the first in a series of books called the Asian Saga series, although you do not need to read the whole series. I believe every single book in the series can work as a standalone.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, just kind of looking into it after I finished Shogun, there are points in the other novels that reference characters or information from other books throughout the saga.
Yeah.
But not to the point where, like, if you hadn't read that book, it will negatively affect your, comprehension of
Right.
that book,
I've heard mixed reviews about some of the other books in the series. I believe King Rat is pretty highly rated.
Yeah.
And I believe Taipan is pretty highly rated. And I've heard kind of like about some of the other ones.
Yeah.
And they're all in varying lengths. I mean, Shogun itself is 1,000 pages-ish, depending on the edition you get. But there's a couple that are maybe 500 or less. And there's 6 books total in the series, I believe.
I think it's 7.
6 or 7.
Yeah.
So, and
they're all pretty long. I mean, I think there's 1 or 2 of them that are in the 300 to 500 page.
Yeah, I think
range,
there's 2 that are sub 500.
Most of them are pretty long. I actually, and again, I, as usual, didn't do any prior research before recording and can't look it up in real time. But
the Wi-Fi, I mean the cell service here is kind of okay.
Yeah,
you might be able to get a little signal, but
I actually think at least 1 or 2 of the other books in the saga are longer than Shogun.
Oh, cool. Well, that's something to look forward to.
Yeah.
I was thinking about it, and Shogun kind of kicked off our reading friendship.
Yes.
Because you were just getting kind of more into serious reading, and I was also like, oh, I want to start reading more fiction. And in 2022, we both read that as the first book that we read that year, or was it 21?
It was like the tail end of 21, early 22, because I remember I started reading it around the holidays 2021.
Okay.
Because that's when I had the first time I got COVID.
Yeah.
And I was, at least for the first few days, quarantining at home.
Right. Okay.
With my parents.
That makes sense.
And they had gotten me that as a Christmas gift. So I was like, well, as once my cognition kind of slowly came back, I delved into it a little bit more.
So let's talk briefly about your thoughts on the book, and then we'll move to the show. For me, I really enjoyed Shogun while I was reading it. I liked it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those books that, after the fact, I really started to appreciate more, especially when you do read. I've always been a reader, but the more you read, then you kind of look back and you compare stuff, and you're like, well, you know what? Honestly, that was actually very well done.
Right.
I don't know how you feel about it.
I remember it, and granted, it's been a little over 2 years and some 150, 160 books ago. So
right.
my memory of it isn't great, but I think I was in a similar camp. Like it took me, a bit to really get into it.
Mm-hmm.
That was, like you said, kind of right at that transition point where I started to get into a little bit more serious literature, and started to transition away from stuff that's just like strictly narrative.
Right.
And not that Shogun is just plot and nothing else. There's definitely some bigger themes to it, but it is a very narrative driven book.
Mm-hmm.
And just, with the length and the scope of it, it takes some time to set all that up. So, it took me a little bit of time to get into it, but once I started to like really appreciate the characters and their narrative and all that, I was pretty hooked. And I remember really enjoying it. I think I had similar feelings to you. Like after I finished it, I started to appreciate it a little bit more.
Yeah.
I think with any book of that length, it's hard to sustain a narrative for, that long of a book, that many pages. And I think Clavell did a really good job with that.
Yeah.
So
yeah, despite its length, it didn't feel that long.
no.
And I think you and I had only talked about there being one kind of little lull, maybe right around the 700 page mark. But for most part, the pacing is really good. The way I always describe it, and maybe it's a little cliche, is I call it like Game of Thrones of feudal Japan.
Yeah.
Obviously, Clavell wrote Shogun before George R. R. Martin wrote A Song of Fire and Ice, or whatever it's called. But the wide cast of characters and that duality of doing a really good job of like making you hate a character and then like making you sympathize for them later,
Right.
or vice versa,
Right.
making you feel like this person's the good guy and then it turns out they're not the good guy, or
Right.
There's a really good job in the book of that element, which I really appreciated. And then you kind of come to learn like that's not easy to do. And
Right.
not a lot of books do that effectively.
Right.
And so I really enjoy that complexity because I think that really kind of reflects humanity. And in our culture now, we certainly have a very binary thinking about, people we agree with or disagree with.
Right.
You're either in or you're out kind of sentiment, but that's not really real life.
No.
Most people, even really good people, do sucky things. And even people that I agree with, might do something I disagree with, on principle
Yeah.
and there's people that I fundamentally, have really big disagreements with, but sometimes they say things I'm like, well, they're right about that, you know? And so, I really think it kind of captured that realism quite well. It's interesting, some of the feedback or some of the critiques I've read about Shogun. Some people kind of thought it was like your typical like white savior kind of story. And I was like, I didn't get that at all from it. In fact, I thought Blackthorn was kind of a bumbling, fumbling idiot.
Yeah.
Through most of it. Sorry for the maybe minor spoiler there, but yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that element? Did you think it was like a, kind of racist white guy, kind of painting these 2D, cultured characters, or what?
I didn't really think that way. I mean, I guess on some level I could see how some people might feel that way.
Yeah.
I think it's easy, to kind of jump to that conclusion when you see that, it's a novel about feudal Japan written by an old white guy,
Right.
A
British guy.
yeah, like it's easy to kind of to jump to that conclusion.
Yeah.
I think I vaguely remember you and I talking about this while we were reading, that, for as much as Blackthorn is used to kind of move the plot along, after a certain point, he's not really the main character.
Right.
Which
is again a little bit of a minor spoiler. Sorry for anybody that hasn't read it or seen the show.
Right.
Yeah.
But, the other the lords and samurais and just other, Japanese characters that he comes to meet and interact with, and the intricacies of their society and culture and the politics, they kind of become, come to the forefront of the story. I think you could, again, kind of make some kind of broad statement about that kind of novel being written by a white guy from Britain.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think, I wouldn't call it like a white savior.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're caught up on the show. They're five episodes in. What are your thoughts on the television show thus far?
I'm enjoying it for the most part. I do like it. I think the cinematography is great. They definitely do a good job of, showing you what Japan looked like at that time. And
yeah, the world looks very realistic.
Yes. And I think there are large parts of the novel that are kind of set describing that setting. It's not a Dickensian, like, over the top description, but Clavell definitely does describe what the environment looks like.
He had the pages for it,
right,
sure.
Right. And so I think they did a good job of in the show. Like, so obviously you can't just like have a character narrating what the environment looks like. So I think they do a good job showing you what it looked like, or what the world looked like at that time, without having it to be like overly explained. I do think the narrative, and again, it's been a while since I've read, so maybe I'm a little off here, but I do think the narrative's been moving a little quicker than I remembered.
That's my big critique, for sure.
The
pacing is too fast.
It definitely moves pretty quickly. I don't think, at least so far, they've done a great job explaining or showing you the intricacies of the characters and the kind of political nature of things. How you were talking about how you meet this character, and for your first 100 pages or so with that character, you just really hate him or her, and then you kind of, it switches and you start to understand where he stands in the kind of social and political hierarchy, and why he is the way he is, why he makes the decisions he makes, things like that.
Right.
I think there's a little bit more to be desired there. Like it hasn't built up that kind of sympathy or deeper understanding of the characters. I wouldn't go so far as to say they're two-dimensional, but there could just be a little bit more.
So you absolutely nailed it. I think the pacing is a little too fast, and they are not exploring a lot of the subplots that are in the book. And I do think that is one of the things that made Game of Thrones, the television show, so good, is that there were so many subplots. Now, ultimately, they failed to resolve many of them, and that's a discussion for a different day. However, Shogun has all of those elements, and I just feel like they're really simplifying a lot of it, and that's taking away from a lot of the magic of the book.
Yeah.
I think a really good example is Omi. He is Yushiga's nephew. And so one of the reasons why I think that kind of like duality of the characters exists in the book is because of the hierarchical nature of the Japanese society at the time. And it's like everyone has their role in this hierarchy, and so they're trying to save face while they lead that role, and please whoever's above them, but they also have their own internal desires and goals. And so then you have this like really nice layered cake of that, like in the book. And so, you have in the book Toranaga, who, kind of oversees his whole faction. And then you have Yushiga, who's I think that's his name, he has like his own fiefdom.
Right.
And And so, he kind of is the ruler of that region, but technically Toranaga has ultimate say,
Right.
even though Toranaga doesn't live there, interact with the army there, whatever. And then you have Omi, who's Yoshiga's nephew, who's kind of like his right-hand man, but he, like, in the book, thinks his uncle's an idiot. And so he's trying to constantly, like, please his stupid uncle, but he has his own goal. And then Omi was, like, the first person that Blackthorn really interacted with when they crashed on the coast. And so him and Blackthorn have this beef, which they kind of showed in the first episode, but they don't really like.
That was kind of it. It doesn't really expand from there.
Right. And so I really feel like that character is missing a lot. The politics with Lady Ochiba are totally this point are just like completely washed over.
Yeah.
I mean, there's one scene, and again, this is a minor spoiler for people if you haven't seen the show. There's one scene where she kind of tells Ishida, like, who's on the Regent Council, and it's kind of like
the head honcho.
She kind of like tells him how it is, and he just takes it. And I feel like if you didn't read the book, you're just like, why is that a thing?
Right.
How can she get away with that? So
I think they've also, on the note of kind of not really detailing out that political hierarchy, at least in my opinion, they kind of just throw characters at you.
Yeah.
In the novel, I remember like characters were introduced a little bit more, carefully is the wrong way to put it, but like the character was introduced and you got some backstory at the same time.
Yes.
In the show, like this guy just kind of walks onto the screen and you're like, who is he? Why is he important? And you kind of, which again, it's kind of hard to introduce a character on screen without just having, blanket exposition kind of explaining his importance.
Right.
Which is, I remember, we'll probably come back to this later in the conversation, but one of my critiques about the White Noise movie, where like characters just kind of show up and you don't really get a sense of who they are, why they're relevant to the narrative, why they're relevant to the point. And I've felt the same way, like watching this TV show, like you were saying earlier, if you haven't read the book and, they also don't really like, they don't even, I feel like there were some characters they don't even really like give a name to right away.
Correct.
Like if you haven't read the book and you're kind of watching and you're like, who is this guy? Why is he important? And even after they name the character, you're still kind of like, okay, so what? If you didn't have that prior knowledge of the narrative in the novel, like,
I think it's more forgivable for a movie because you have 2 to 3 hours to get it done. And so sometimes you're just going to have to simplify things. And I know it was not to continually beat this Game of Thrones horse here, but I do think it is a good metaphorical tool or example for people to understand. I haven't read any of the Game of Thrones books, but there were some characters that they collapsed into kind of one, and that was a little bit of a critique. However, I do think in general they probably did a good job of staying true to the story and really kind of exploring those subplots and giving that background history, or maybe at least alluding to it so you have some context on those characters. Another big chunk that's missing from Shogun is the priests.
Yeah.
So they play a major role in the book, and they're a little bit in the first couple episodes, but one of the priests served as a translator for Blackthorn for a much longer period of time.
Yes.
Before
Mariko.
And that was such an interesting duality because this guy has to appease, Toranaga and give a faithful translation, but he is literally mortal enemies with Blackthorn because Blackthorn is a Protestant and he's Catholic. So that added such an interesting element to it, and there were so many politics between what the Portuguese wanted and what Blackthorn wants and what Toranaga wants, and there's head guys on that Regent Council that are very Christian, and they kind of touch on it, but like in the book, they really flesh that out.
Right.
And so I feel like I understand what's going on because I've read the book, but I feel like if you've just watched the show, you might not really appreciate how deep that those divisions go.
And I think in the novel, at least up to the point in the main narrative where the TV show is at now, 5 episodes in, if I remember correctly, Blackthorn had more interaction with Ashido and the Council of Regents as well. Like,
Yeah.
He had, I think in the show up to this point, he's gone before them once, and it was, maybe he hasn't at all. I don't remember.
I think he did have one because they sent him to prison, remember?
Yeah, but that was, he was talking to Toranaga, and Ashido came in,
Right.
and Toranaga was saving face, like, fine, take him to prison.
Right.
I don't,
Yeah, I'd have to go back and rewatch,
but either way, whether it was one or none, I think up to this point in the novel, he had definitely had, even if it was, again, in the novel, only one conversation, it was definitely more sustained, and the priests were involved. I think in a sense, almost in the TV show, at least to this point, like, Blackthorn is still kind of the main character, or his story is still kind of the main one.
Right.
So
it's, I mean, I'm curious to know if some of these decisions were made, or why some of these decisions were made. And I guess with television, you run the risk of like, maybe we are going to do this slow pace and be very truthful to the book, but we actually don't know if people are going to like the show or if it's going to get renewed for a second season. And so maybe you're just like, oh, well, we don't want to make this like half told story. So like, let's just plan on, is it going to be one season?
Right.
If they make multiple seasons, is it going to stay Shogun, or is it going to pursue the rest of the Asian saga, which based on what I haven't read any of the other books in the series, but based on what I understand, I don't think that would work.
No.
Because they're completely different sets of characters, different time periods. It's like a very loosely related thread.
I think a kind of like anthology like that, works better as a novel.
Yeah.
I don't know, like if you looked at something like, a show like True Detective or the Fargo series.
Yeah.
Like those are all different settings, different characters, different narratives, things like that. I don't know if you could do an anthology series like that with the Asian saga. Like I don't know.
Well, I mean, True Detective certainly suffered in a way.
Yeah.
Everyone loved season 1. It's considered one of the best single seasons of television ever.
Right.
I loved it. I've watched it twice. It's fantastic. And I've watched a little bit of season 2, which everyone says is terrible.
Yeah.
I didn't watch season 3. I just watched season 4, which I thought started so strongly and had so much potential, and ultimately was kind of crap.
I thought season 3 was great. I mean, season 1's definitely the best, and I would agree with you, it was probably one of, if not the best single season of television, at least in recent history. But I thought season 3 was really good.
Yeah, I've heard good things about season 3, but still, you have this kind of like ebb and flow of
right.
But I guess that's not necessarily due to the fact that it's an anthology,
Right.
but it does make it difficult because like the character of Rust in True Detective season 1 is so beloved that people would watch 100 seasons of that guy.
Right.
And the dynamic between Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson was really
Fantastic.
good.
Yeah.
And I feel like, especially season 4, they really struggled to like have that dynamic again. So that makes it difficult. But yeah, I am curious to know kind of what the long-term vision for Shogun, the television show, is, because right now their foot is on the gas.
Yeah, I think, and whether they were concerned, there were concerns that they would only get one season out of it, or that, if they kind of told it at a slower pace, they might not get as much interest to be renewed for, a second season or beyond that. But I think, you know, if it was told at a pace that was more faithful to the novel, and at kind of a Game of Thrones style where some of the more minor plots are expanded on, it's definitely something that could have been a 2 to 3 season series.
At least,
you know, like there's enough there that if they really wanted to expand and go deeper into the more intricate details of the society at the time, like they could have done that.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, they could have done a whole like prologue of like Blackthorn in England before they even left. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like there's so much that's kind of just like assumed or hinted at, you know, when Blackthorn talks about his past or whatever. But
even that was just kind of a quick thing. It was just, oh yeah, I have a wife and 2 kids and they're at home thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
But in the novel, you get much more of him like being kind of introspective about that. And, you know, like, what am I doing on the other side of the planet when I have a family at home? And he starts to like, I mean, again, it's been a while, but like almost kind of question his faith to his family and his purpose as a sailor. Like,
yeah. And just his whole, you know, he goes through a very long transition of like, the Japanese are just these savages.
Right.
The whole way of life is backwards, to being like, I kind of like it here.
And know? Yeah, the same thing in the within the novel, like that, his kind of appreciation and understanding of the Japanese culture at the time, like you really get to see that develop.
Yeah,
you know, there's bits and pieces of it here and there in the show where he's like starting to figure it out, but it's more so like, okay, this is how I have to behave. It's not him like appreciating why things the way they are.
Yeah. The other critique I have about the show, which I'm probably alone on, is it looks to me like it was filmed in 60 frames per second. And so I'll geek out on camera tech really quickly. Moving images are literally just a series of pictures played back at high speed. And so to the human brain, it looks like a moving image. And the standard for cinema for a long time has been 24 frames per second. And there's a little bit of debate about why that is the case. There were some technological constraints when film became a thing, where that was like kind of the optimal amount of, frames we could actually fit on a strip of film per second. Some people say that it mimics how the natural the eye sees real movement very closely. And some people think that like the only reason we still use it is because now we're all conditioned to seeing it. Most television broadcasts are, like if you watch the news, are broadcast in 30 frames per second, and a lot of sports are broadcast or filmed in 60 or higher, broadcast in 30, and then you can use those higher frame rates like 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second to do slow motion. So for example, if you film something in 60 frames per second, you can slow it down to half speed, show it in 30 frames per second, and it will still look smooth. If you don't have enough frames when you slow it down, that's when you get like real juddery slow-mo. So anyway, working in this industry with moving images, I can very quickly tell, I look at footage all day, every day, if something's 24 frames per second or not, or higher. And I think personally, anything higher than 24 frames per second for cinema looks very goofy to me. And it looks like they filmed it in 60 frames per second. Why would they do that? I don't know. Sometimes people do it as a stylistic choice. There's been some instances of it, like some smaller budget films that are like action films sometimes do like a high frame rate, not to be played back in slow motion, but to just be played back at real speed, because the type of motion blur you get with more frames is where there's less motion blur. So sometimes it can add this like hyper realism to it. I think like it was maybe The Hobbit or one of the Lord of the Rings movies was filmed in like something very odd, like 52 frames per second. And if you go and watch it, you might not necessarily be able to put your finger on what looks weird about it or what looks different, but you will see what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So that really bothers me. And then the pacing. But like you said, I do think the cinematography is pretty good overall. The set building is great. I do think the acting is pretty good. There are a couple characters, actually like the very first scene when they're on the ship. Blackthorn is the pilot, but he wasn't the actual captain. So there was a guy kind of like above him. He was just like the skilled operator of the boat. That guy that played the captain, who basically they just like kill off right in the first scene. I thought his acting was like, when I put the show on, I was like, ooh, we're not off to a good start here. But I do think a lot of the people that play the Japanese characters are fantastic.
The actress that plays Mariko is unbelievable.
She's
great.
She's great. I think the guy that plays Toranaga is good. And what's interesting is I saw, on Facebook, like some ad for Shogun popped up, and I saw that the post had like 2,000 comments. I was like, ooh, I got to see what people are saying. And so many people were complaining about the fact that it has subtitles. And I guess I get it. Like, we do have technology now that can literally change the way your mouth looks like it's moving. So when you dub something, it doesn't look dubbed. But it's not always accurate. It's probably very time consuming to do. And I'm just like, guys, like, is it that hard to read subtitles? Like,
Right.
They did everyone a favor, because the dialogue in the book between Mariko and Blackthorn, it's actually Portuguese, not English.
Right.
And they kind of say that in the show, but they just speak English. So that's kind of interesting, but yeah, I thought it was weird that people were complaining about it, because another show you and I have been watching also takes place in Japan, Tokyo Vice. And very impressively, there's multiple American or non-Japanese actors that learned fluent Japanese.
Yeah.
And I love it.
Yeah.
I love the fact that they speak Japanese in their subtitles. I think that adds so much realism to it.
Yeah. I think given the way in the novel that there is this kind of stunted communication, things that get lost in translation, like, or what you were speaking about earlier about how like the priests, they have to give a faithful translation to whatever Japanese lord they're interpreting for, but they also have to balance their personal feelings.
Right.
Like those kind of intricacies would be lost if everything was just in English.
Yeah.
Like the kind of some of the overarching themes or points of the novel would be lost if the show was just all in English.
Yeah.
One scene that I thought was really interesting or well done, and it was I believe it was when Blackthorn was speaking with Toranaga, and I don't remember if it was the priest or Mariko interpreting, but they kind of cut out the interpretation. You'd have Toranaga ask his question in Japanese and it's subtitled, and then you would get Blackthorn responding and in Portuguese or English for the viewer, and then it's just Toranaga. They're kind of going back and forth without cutting out the middleman. There are a couple scenes in the book where one of the priests is so skilled of an interpreter, he kind of does it in real time. Like,
Right.
When if Blackthorn kind of pauses to formulate the next half of his sentence or just catch his breath or whatever, like the priest has already,
Yeah.
translated what he just said, and it's, much higher pace. I think, doing that in the show where it's just Japanese, English, without the translation kind of lets you keep some of that, that element without, having two characters like speaking over each other.
Yeah.
I'm sure from an audio standpoint, that would be kind of tricky to manage.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, it's even with, I'm the type of person where I can have a lot of critiques of something and I'm still enjoying it.
Right.
I think overall it is a good show. If you have no idea about the book and you're watching the show, I'm sure you're probably enjoying it.
Yeah.
I just think it's like there's so much more that it could be. I guess because I know the potential.
Yeah.
So that brings us to our next phase of this conversation, which is, what are, I don't know that either of us have an extensive reading history of things that have been turned into movies or shows, but do you have any particular adaptations that you particularly love or particularly hated?
I mean, I've been pretty critical of the White Noise adaptation.
Yeah.
Just in general, like, I didn't think it was a faithful adaptation, but I didn't even think it was a good movie. I think I called it quits about halfway through because I just, but I was looking a little bit last night or this morning at some, book to movie adaptations. I think, the only ones, at least on the list that I looked at where I've read, actually, there was only one on the list where I've read the book and seen the movie, and that was No Country for Old Men.
Mm-hmm.
The only other one that like immediately jumped out to me that I've, again, read and seen the adaptation was Inherent Vice.
Mm.
And, I saw the adaptation of No Country for Old Men well before I read the book.
Yeah, I heard that's a movie that's extremely faithful to the text, which makes sense because it started as a screenplay.
Right.
Didn't get picked up.
So we turned it into a novel.
Turned into a novel, and then it got adapted to a film.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think not as this is not a critique towards McCarthy, but where his writing style, at least in that novel, is, I wouldn't say minimal, but it's a little bit more sparse.
For sure.
There's not as much, for lack of a better word, filler that you need to try and figure out how you're going to get it on the screen.
Yeah.
It's certainly not all exposition, but it's with something like that, like it's a little bit easier to, again, especially since it was originally written as a screenplay, like that's something that's a little bit more easier to adapt, I would think.
Yeah, I thought Inherent Vice, the movie, was pretty good. I don't think Pynchon's dialogue style translates to visual very well.
Yeah.
There were some lines in the movie that were directly from the book, and I just felt like that no one would like talk this way in real life, but he made it work in the context of the writing.
Yeah. I remember because I read the book and then shortly thereafter saw the movie, and I remember liking the movie but thinking there were things from the book that were left out, which is going to happen in any adaptation.
Sure.
But like, I thought it was just stuff like that could have been in the movie. Like that would have been fun to see on the screen.
Yeah.
I don't, I'm having trouble remembering what any of those specifics were, but none of them stuck out to me as like, okay, this would be difficult to adapt just based on the context of the novel or how the scene in the novel is written.
Yeah.
It just kind of was like, we don't need that, or,
Right.
Let's save some time so we have a 2-hour movie instead of a 3-hour movie.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Whenever this topic comes up, the two that always come to mind for me is Jaws and Jurassic Park. I saw both the films before I read the books, which is not my preference. Jaws is probably one of my favorite films. It was a pioneering film for so many reasons. The book is awful. I've said this in short form content. I've said this in conversations with people before. I honestly can't believe anyone turned it into a movie, and I can't believe Peter Benchley had a career. It's so bad. And so I think at this point everyone's seen Jaws, so hopefully this isn't spoiling it for anyone. But in the movie, it's very clearly we're being terrorized by this shark, and we need to solve that problem. And there's a lot of politics around how to do that. And, there's this element of like, it's a beach town that really depends on the income from the summer season, and this is going to ruin that. And, do we keep the beaches open? Do we not? There's a foreword in the edition of the book that I read from Peter Benchley where he's like, oh, the movie's great, but I wrote this novel and it's really a novel about like the mafia and this and that. And there's all these great, twists and turns that the movie wasn't able to include. And I really hope you enjoy it. And you're like, oh, okay, cool. And then it's like, it reads like a trashy 70s, like softcore porno. Jesus. It's so bad. The characters are just so trite, and it's like, again, sorry for the spoilers. The chief of police, his like wife bangs the scientist and cheats on her husband, and like there's a little bit of this mafia element where they kind of allude to like the mafia is putting the mayor up to keeping the beaches open because they have this like big real estate deal that it's going to affect, but they never really like get into it. It's just bad. The writing is bad. The plot makes no sense. The shark is an afterthought essentially. And credit to everyone involved with the film to, I guess, kind of see the gold. The diamond in the rough there, and have the vision to bring it to life in a better way. But it's just terrible. The book is just terrible. And then probably my favorite, one of my favorite adaptations is Jurassic Park. And so I saw that film, as a young man, probably 12 or 13 years old in the theater. I was like terrified by the dinosaurs. But I've always said that, despite that being an action movie, that movie is really so good because of the dialogue.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is lifted directly from Michael Crichton's book by the same name. And I think Crichton was probably a little bit of an underrated writer, and he obviously wrote a lot of action kind of sci-fi-ish stuff, but he really tackled a lot of big questions about humanity. Like Jurassic Park is really all about like, just because we have the ability to we've come up with this technology, like, should we use it? What are the ethics around it? Who should have access to it?
Right.
And that's another story where they do a good job of like, that duality of like, is this person good or are they bad? And so the book has a little bit more of almost like a horror type of element to it. It's a little bit more graphic than the movie, even though people get eaten on screen in the movie. But I thought that book was fantastic, and I thought the movie was just as good, if not a little bit better. I think the only reason I would rate the film better is because, with dinosaurs, to have them come to life on screen is
right.
It's hard to compete with that.
Right.
Even though the dinosaurs are a little bit of a red herring to the major themes of the book. So there are a ton of adaptations, it seems like recently more than ever. The Three Body Problem, which is a popular recent sci-fi, that just came out as a television show. The Sympathizer is coming out as a show, or is out already.
I didn't I think it's still coming out because I haven't seen anything. I feel like we probably talked about this before, but I probably totally forgot.
So it's on its way. Obviously, Shogun, Dune.
Yep.
The sequel to Dune just came out, which has been massively popular.
Killers of the Flower Moon.
Killers of the Flower Moon. Supposedly they're making The Wager, which is David Grant's more recent novel or nonfiction. There were some books that I looked up because I wanted to read some books that had a similar vibe to True Detective Season 4. And one of those books that I picked up was a 2018 release, and that's been already turned into a Netflix movie.
What's that one?
I forget what it is. I'll drop it in post when I do the edit on this, but I forget what it is. Something about the edge of the world, maybe. Hey everyone, Editor Tony here. The book I was referencing was Hold the Dark by William Giraldi, and it was adapted into a film for Netflix in 2018.
Gotcha.
But I was looking for books that kind of combined like a murder mystery with indigenous peoples and like the Alaskan climate or like treacherous climates, because that's kind of what like the essence of True Detective Season 4 is. What else is there that's come out recently that's an adaptation? I mean, it's like Leave the World Behind. That was a Netflix movie last year that was based on a fairly recent book. So
there's some rumblings that Paul Thomas Anderson's newest movie that's, I believe, currently in production or it being filmed,
right,
may or may not be an adaptation of another Thomas Pynchon novel.
Yeah, is it Vineland? Or,
yeah.
And there are some rumblings about Blood Meridian by McCarthy being turned into a film.
Yes.
So maybe somebody knows the answer to this. Because we don't prepare, I don't know the answer. But what are your guesses as to why this is so common now?
Capitalism rearing its ugly head, and nobody has any original ideas anymore, and they're taking things that were successful and just redoing them to try and capture that success.
Yeah. I read a book 2 years ago called The Death of the Artist. I always forget the author's name. And it's about how being an artist, no matter what your medium is, has changed drastically with the internet. And he kind of goes chapter by chapter with each medium. So there's a chapter about music, there's a chapter about film. One of the things he talks about with film is the reason why like kind of cheesy action movies have become so popular and have dominated, the majority of like the big productions is because basically studios have realized if you can appeal to an international audience, you can make more money. And so movies that don't rely a lot on dialogue and are more visual are easier to translate because you don't have to read a lot of subtitles and you don't have to speak the original language to appreciate what's happening on screen.
Right.
And so you just have big explosions and, crazy graphics, and then it'll do well in foreign countries, even if it's an American movie, which makes a lot of sense and is a little sad.
Yeah.
And I think, and he also posits that's why a lot of some of the best moving image media is in television now, because you have the talented writers who would normally be hired to write movies, and those aren't
right.
they're not needed basically.
Right.
They don't need a talented writer to make some Michael Bay movie.
Right.
And so these people are finding contracts, smaller budget contracts with television. But then, there was like the writer's strike last year. And so I can't help but wonder if the industry's kind of like, well, we'll just circumvent you and we'll just
use existing source material. Yeah.
Right. And maybe it's a better deal or cheaper to get started if you're just going to give somebody royalties.
Yeah.
So if it flops, you didn't spend a lot of money out of pocket. If it does well, yeah, maybe you'll give up a little bit bigger piece of the pie, but you're making money too.
Right. I wonder how much of it has to do with the recent prevalence of audiobooks, if that could be a factor, in the sense that, and not to get into the book versus audiobook. Is it reading? Is it not debate? Because I know we both have pretty strong feelings about that. And that would eat up the rest of this episode. But, you know, whether you want to call it reading or not, if you are listening to an audiobook, from a sensory standpoint, you are engaging with it in a different way than if you physically read the book. You know, that's the main point of where my argument against audiobooks comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to think that most people would agree, whether you consider it reading or not. I think if you listen to an audiobook, you still engage with the book, whether it's a narrative or a nonfiction or, you know, somewhere in between. You still engage with the book. I wonder if that has contributed, you know, these filmmakers or TV producers or whatever, seeing that this different medium of engaging with a novel or a nonfiction book has become so prevalent and is a popular thing now.
Yeah.
If they're kind of going, oh, okay, people want to engage with these narratives in a way other than just sitting and reading the book.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there's a couple things to consider in that regard. First of all, and one of our first episodes was about, is the internet a positive or a negative for the reading community? Mm-hmm. In that book I was talking about before, The Death of the Artist, he kind of touches on this, where one of the positives is that of the internet is that it allows even small, very niche communities to connect,
right,
and basically form a more powerful community than they would have otherwise. And for example, there's not that many people that probably read Thomas Pynchon, but we're friends with all of them on Instagram,
right.
You know? And we've been able to find each other. So that's cool. And there was a time where it seemed like books were kind of going the way of the radio, more or less. And now people are a little bit surprised because in the last few years, independent bookstores have been able to perform better, and they're kind of coming back, and we're seeing the book community kind of rebound. I don't necessarily think that's because more people are reading. I just think it's because people have been able to connect via the internet, and it's making that community stronger.
I would agree with that.
Not necessarily making it bigger, but it's making it stronger, because I do think, like to your point, I do think people are reading less, like as a percentage of the population.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to my comment earlier about people complaining about having to read subtitles, obviously reading a subtitle is not the same as reading a book, but people are complaining about reading,
right, when
it's like not that big of a deal. And so it's easy to kind of say, oh, society's getting stupider because we think of reading as an intellectual pursuit and less people are doing it. And I think there's like a little bit of that at play, but I agree. I think it's just like an easier medium for people to dip in and out of.
Mm-hmm.
You can throw on a movie, you can pay close attention, you can kind of not pay close attention and just have it on the background like our friend Gunnar does all the time. And
like I've been doing lately.
And you still pick up the gist of what's going on. But and again, not to beat the audiobook dead horse, but this is my whole argument about it. It's like the sensory experience does make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
In film, when you study film, there are so many factors that come into play. There is the general composition. So what is in the frame? Do I put someone center frame or off to the side? Do I put them low? Do I put them high? If I shoot a character from above, so the camera's looking down, subconsciously, I'm making them diminutive. You might not realize it as a viewer, but that's what I'm doing. If I shoot them from low up, now I'm giving that character subconscious authority in your mind. the colors I choose to use. There's a great example of that is the newer Blade Runner 2049. If you go back and watch that movie, you will notice a stark difference from scene to scene with the color. And it's like whenever they're talking about one particular character, the screen is this color. Whenever something else is happening, the general tone is a different hue.
Yep.
And so, again, as a viewer, you might not consciously realize it, but it is subconsciously affecting your experience. And then, of course, sound design with visuals. So this is something that people in my industry at my level, where I'm, doing much smaller productions and doing a lot of business to business stuff, people don't realize is sound design. It's like you can have this really great looking image with perfect lighting and color gradings on point, blah, blah, blah. But if there's no like actual sound, like sound effects,
Right.
You can, again, you consciously watching it, you might not notice the sound effects, but if I show you a version without them, you'd be like, oh, that seemed so flat. Like something was clearly missing, even if I couldn't put my finger on it. And so with movies, you have multiple sensories, to experience. And then with audiobooks, if I say like, Andy, you're an idiot, or I say, Andy, you are an idiot. Like I said the same words, but the tone completely changes the meaning.
Right.
And that's what I don't understand. Like when people fight on this, like, oh, audiobooks are exactly the same. Stop making the differentiating them. It's like, well, no. If the narrator is narrating in a certain way, that is going to affect your experience of the book. And I'm not saying one's better than the other. It's just that with writing, when you write something that's is primarily going to be written, you have less of those elements to play with. Mm-hmm. So you have to write in a way that kind of makes up for the lack of, there is no visual, there is no audio. And so I think that's why I appreciate, writing over movies, and why I do prefer to read the book before I see the show, or why the source material is better. There's also the element too of like, and so our friend John, our mutual friend John, who's a big movie buff, he was kind of busting my balls about the 3-body problem. I was like, oh, I'm going to read the book first. And he's like, oh, why? So you can just like critique the show more. And it's like, well, I mean, the source material is usually better.
Right.
It's whoever wrote the book, it's their baby. It's their brainchild. It's their thing that they obsessed over for however long to create it. They care more about it. They probably put more effort into it than like, a production company going, oh, that was a cool story. Make a good movie.
Right.
Let's, assemble a crew and a cast to put it together. So,
well, I think it also goes back to some of the stuff we were saying about Shogun earlier, is you go in whether the adaptation is faithful or not. We've been critiquing the pacing of the show and how they're mostly focusing on these kind of, 1, 2, maybe 3 kind of main plot points.
Yeah.
Without exploring the minor details. But the narratives they have been, following, whether there's stuff cut out or not, they've been faithful.
Yeah.
They haven't changed the trajectory of the narrative.
Right.
But having read the novel, you have a little bit more background on, like we were talking about earlier, like just have a better background of who these characters are.
Yeah.
And, whether you're going to be kind of a hater like we are and just read the novel and turn around and critique the hell out of the movie or the TV show, that's one way to do it. But also, like, you can go in with a little bit more understanding of what's happening.
Yeah.
And you can kind of fill in some of the blanks of what the adaptation might be leaving on the cutting room floor.
Yeah. Have you read Dune?
No.
Have you seen the movie?
No.
You haven't seen either of them?
Either. I haven't seen anything. I remember when the movie came out, because you saw the movie before you read the book, correct?
I did, yeah.
I kind of felt like maybe I'll wait to read the book and then watch the movie. I've kind of started to flip on that. I think with the, recency bias of the new one coming out, I'm like, screw it. I'll just watch the movie. And
I actually think watching the movie helped me read the book.
Interesting.
The book isn't necessarily a hard read as far as like the writing itself, but the world building, he makes up a lot of names and technologies and stuff like that. So to kind of have like a visual association with some of those elements, I thought was helpful. Are there any books that you would love to see as a television show or a movie?
I was thinking a little bit about that as we, through the discussion. I'm trying to think, some of my favorites like, Infinite Jest and Gravity's Rainbow, they would just be horrendous to try and adapt. Yeah. So I wouldn't do that. I think, maybe some of DeLillo's other books, could be really interesting. I think Underworld could be a good one, especially with the way that story is told in reverse chronology. I think that would be really interesting as a movie or a TV show. I really like the idea of some of these, bigger, weightier texts being adapted to TV shows over movies.
Yeah.
I understand if, it's something like White Noise, for example, or Jaws or Jurassic Park or No Country for Old Men, where they're not very long.
Right.
You can't really stretch a 300-ish page book into a 10 episode series, but something like Shogun, where it's 1,000 pages, you can't really make that into a 3-hour movie.
Right.
Like that would be really rushed.
Yeah.
I think that would be a really interesting kind of way to adapt more lengthier novels.
Yeah.
One book that stuck out to me, we were having the discussion, was JR by Gaddis. Just because that is so driven by dialogue, and especially where you have just like characters speaking over each other, the voices of the characters, are so prevalent and so distinct. That would be one that would be really, especially, it's just there's so many hijinks within. I think that would be a really interesting movie. I'm interested to see where PTA takes whatever movie he's working on, what direction that goes in, whether it ends up being a true adaptation or he's just kind of loosely basing some of the characters and narrative on Vineland. I think Crying of Lot 49 could be a really interesting novel, adaptation. It's a short one. There's comparative to pretty much all of Pynchon's other novels.
Yeah.
There's not really multiple narrative threads. I mean, there's a lot of kind of minor things that take place, but they all kind of centrally tie back to the protagonist. I'm sure there's more that I could think of, but
yeah.
Same Bed, Different Dreams could be a cool one.
Yeah.
That would be really cool to see.
I feel like Same Bed, Different Dreams would work well as a show where they maybe kind of like, stick to the book, but like take some of the ideas and maybe expand upon them and make a series out of it. And maybe go places where, Ed couldn't have gone with the book.
And I also think if you were to adapt that, whether it be a movie or a TV show, it doesn't necessarily, you could still follow the kind of 3 separate narrative threads, and it wouldn't necessarily break up the order of them, but it wouldn't necessarily have to be the same structure.
Yeah.
Where you have like the present day, the different past tense stuff, and then the historical sequences. You could kind of, and then rinse and repeat and rinse and repeat.
Yeah.
I think you could kind of intermix those a little bit more and maybe keep the same order. And, again, maybe for time's sake, have to cut out a few things here and there. But like that kind of multi-narrative thread could come together really well.
Yeah.
Thinking about something like a show like Westworld, which is another adaptation.
Yeah, I had no idea actually.
Loose. I don't know how. I mean, obviously, it was.
Who wrote the book?
No idea.
Oh, I do know who it.
I found this out this morning. The actor that plays Toranaga was actually in the third season.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's cool.
Something like that where there's multiple narrative threads and or timelines, and obviously part of the point of that show is not clearly explaining what timeline you're in at the as it's happening.
Right.
But I think on that idea where you kind of jump from timeline to timeline to timeline could be done with something like Same Bed.
I'm attempting to look up who wrote Westworld. Oh, it was Michael Crichton.
No way.
Yeah.
How about that?
Actually, was not who I was thinking. Yeah, I think those are solid picks. I think if I had to pick some, I can't really think of anything that would make a great television show. Because I do think that the kind of approach with television is so much different.
Yeah.
But as far as movies, I mean, there's a lot of classics that have been made into some type of film in the past, which I would just love to see like an updated version with modern cinema techniques and, our current crop of actors and actresses. A lot of people might not know this, but Shogun, they actually did a series in the 70s, I believe.
Yeah.
Which some people love. I think that might be more of a nostalgia thing rather than it being actually a good, well done show.
I'm curious if we get some service back, might have to look it up. But as I've seen people like comparing the recent adaptation and that older one, I've seen it a number of times referred to as like a mini series. I wonder how many episodes that was.
I think it was 10.
Okay.
But I'll have to look it up. But I would love to see a modern Tale of Two Cities movie. I think that would be fantastic. Count of Monte Cristo, there was a terrible 80s version of that. Actually, there's a French, in French cinema, they're coming out with a new one, and it looks epic.
Oh, yeah?
But it's in French. It's subtitled, or maybe it's dubbed, but it's in French. But the cinematography looks insane.
One of, actually a couple of Laszlo Krasznahorkai's novels have been adapted into Hungarian films.
Yep.
I don't know about both of. I don't know the Satan Tango was the film adaptation is Satan Tango.
Yep.
I believe it was Melancholy of Resistance that was adapted as well. I think the title was changed for that.
Gotcha.
The adaptation for Satan Tango is 7 hours long.
That's too long.
Black and white.
I'm out.
I'm
not that much of a film nerd.
It definitely seems to be more of a film nerds type of movie.
Oh, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. That was another adaptation that I thought was quite well done. Both the American and Swedish versions. So there's 3 books in the series. They made Swedish versions of each book, and then in America we just made the one of the first book with Daniel Craig and I'm struggling with names today. I'm also confused because it's a different actress for the female lead in the American version versus the is it Rooney Mara that's in the American version? I think it is. So I think Crime and Punishment would probably make a cool movie.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's ever been adapted.
I don't know.
At any point in time, but I'm kind of surprised something like that hasn't been brought to the big screen. There's a couple non-fictions that I think would make great movies. Shadow Divers by Robert Kurson would be super intense as a movie. And Last Boat Out of Shanghai would make a great movie, I think, as well. That's about, and I think I gave you a copy of that to read. That's about the period in China where the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, cede power to the communists with Mao. And it follows the stories of 4 people that are all unrelated, but living in China at that time, and how that affected each of their lives, and kind of, the different storylines there, I think would make for a really interesting movie. East of Eden, I think, would be a cool movie.
Yeah.
There's a lot you could probably cut out of that would be okay, because it's not necessarily pertinent to the narrative. It's just you're glad it's in there because Steinbeck does such a fantastic job with the writing.
Right.
But as far as like the narrative is concerned, you could probably chop it out and still have a really compelling film. I really struggle to think of anything that I love as a book that would make a good television show, though, other than, like Shogun, which I think is appropriate.
Right.
The Sympathizer as a TV show will be interesting because that's not a super long book.
Right.
There is a sequel that neither of us have read yet. But I think, like, I don't know, if you were to say, like, do you think The Sympathizer should be a book or a movie? I would probably say movie. I think
it could be an interesting TV adaptation, though. Like, I don't think, that obviously it's a shorter book, but it's not like it's a super fast pace.
Right.
I think that's one.
You do wonder if they're going to expand on some of the ideas.
Right. I wonder if there would be maybe more, flashbacks to the time in Vietnam.
Right.
I wonder if they'll like start them in America and then kind of have the initial chapters where they're all in Vietnam.
Right. And flashbacks to his childhood, which was complicated. Yeah.
Right. I think there's ways you could stretch that out.
I wonder how they're going to handle the narrator / protagonist not being named.
Yeah.
Because he has no name in the book. So that'll be interesting to see how they tackle that. Trying to think what else. Yeah, I don't know. It's just
Love and Terror could be a good one.
Oh, hell yeah. Good call. Love and Terror. Yeah, that's such a cool book, man.
Yeah.
Was that William Herrick, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was for sure a good one. Although, the elites probably wouldn't like people seeing
Probably not.
seeing
Probably
a movie
not. No,
about
that one, given the current state of the world, probably wouldn't go over very well.
Yeah, violent terrorists terrorizing people for the greater good, supposedly.
Yeah. Anti-Semitic violent terrorists.
Yeah. There is some elements of that for sure, yeah. So, anywho, I think that's all I have to say about the matter. Anything else you want to share with the world?
No, trying to think if there's any other books that I think would be interesting to watch an adaptation of.
Yeah, if you're watching along, tell us what your favorite or least favorite adaptations are, and if there's a book that you would love to see on screen, let us know. And I mean, I can't even. I wanted to pull up a list. I'm sure somewhere on the internet there's probably a list of recent adaptations. I just got a text message that says we're still working on resolving your internet service.
Oh.
So
sounds like you'll be in the Stone Age for the rest of the day.
Yeah, which is unfortunate because I wanted to watch some motorcycle racing, but I digress. All right, well, that is it for today's episode, and be on the lookout. We have some guests coming up, and hopefully getting back to our regular schedule, and we'll see all y'all next time.
See ya.